Hello and welcome to the Science for a Conscious World podcast. My name is Terry Sexton and today I'm talking with Debbie Livingston, who is researching the experiences of therapists working with autistic clients. Her research sets out to identify and define the gaps in supervision support, theoretical and experiential knowledge and clinical experience. In doing so, she explores what may be needed to support therapists' clinical work and their personal and professional development to help them better support their autistic clients' unique needs. Debbie works as a therapist and a supervisor herself and is a PhD student with the Aleph Trust and Canterbury Christ Church University. Debbie, welcome and thank you for joining me today to talk about your research.
Brilliant. Hi, Terry. Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure. So just to start with, really I want to talk a little bit about my experience of working with autistic people and the difficulties I find in doing that, because in my work as a business psychologist, I often meet people with autism who do wonderful work and make a significant contribution to their organisation and to society. And I'm finding this especially in industries that draw on the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. So it's very clear to me that society benefits tremendously from neurodiversity, and it's greatly needed as we seek to tackle the complex problems that society is facing, such as climate change. Yet autism is a medical diagnosis. So it appears to me that we seem to be almost pathologizing a section of our society. So really what I have in my mind from my experience of both of those, is autism a superpower or is it an illness that is medicalized? What's your view? What's your research saying?
Right. So I think one myth to bust is this idea that it's either a superpower or it's a disability. It's only been identified as a disability, right? So the word autism comes from Cranner's original piece of work that identified these traits. And over time, all the diagnostic criteria have changed and adapted, and just because new information has come to light and our experience has grown. But we don't have a model for what a person with those traits is like if they're not going to get picked up by the medical system. So it begs the question, what is an autistic person who's not identified by diagnostic criteria? And what would the word for that be? So there are plenty of people who we currently categorize as autistic people who don't seek medical support and are living their lives fine. And to all intents and purposes, the functional impairment isn't actually a thing for them. They have nuances and differences and they are finding adaptive ways to cope. Whether that's through seeking an industry that's more sympathetic to those kind of frameworks, or they're just adapting differently in the world or the communities that they're in. So the social disability model says exactly that it's the society that we're in that makes these constraints happen. And then somehow we are labeling people based on those constraints to say that they're then disabled, which is just a bizarre concept, really. So it's much more about actually how do we really come down to understanding human beings and their differences, rather than whether a label is the correct label or whether a particular profession has the correct label for that. Now, this doesn't get away from some people actually having needs and requirements, and part of that medical model is about accepting them, getting access to those. So, for example, social support, educational support, financial support, because there's a lot of statistics about people with autistic people having difficulties with employment, with education, with housing, with all of these kind of things. So there is a real need to have a label to access that support. But it's just weird that we have that label that then categorizes human beings. And, you know, as we know, as transpersonal therapists, human beings don't really fit labels.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Thank you for exploring that with me, Debbie. Yeah. Both of my daughters are primary school teachers. And so I recognize what you say there, because the children who are demonstrating perhaps autistic traits then become diagnosed and medicalised, and the school then gets more resource to support those children. And I've often thought, well, the reason why these children perhaps are struggling and need more support is because the education system isn't set up to work with diversity as such.
Yeah.
And so these children are given extra support to almost fit them into the education system rather than working with their unique needs. So I think perhaps, as what you're saying is, whilst that label can be useful, we get the support, it's because society as a whole struggles to work with diversity. Is that what you're saying, Debbie?
I am. A colleague once said to me, why do we all start at 9 o'clock in the morning? And her husband said to her, because the people who get up early decided. And I think this applies to this, is the neuronormative people got up and decide what the rules were and decide the systems, and didn't actually kind of do a bit more of a case study on what the requirements of those systems would be to actually create something inclusive. And we've created a system, well, systems which are excluding. You know, even look at doing a PhD. You know, you need the finances to do it and the resources to do it. So, you know, when we come to doing more identity type issues, actually culture and professional agendas come in massively into designing how people, the systems that people then have to fit into in order to be able to take part in them.
Yes, I fully recognise that in many ways. All of us, to a certain degree, have to fit in order to get benefits from a system that's not designed for us in many different ways. But I picked up on the language that you were using and use that language myself when talk about people with autistic traits. And this is one thing that I've struggled with, is what is the right language and narrative, because I'm very sensitive about my ignorance around the subjects and my clumsiness, leading me to use language which is, you know, offensive to people. So what I struggle with sometimes, you know, we kind of use the label as an identity. So, you know, autism as an identity, I am autistic, or sometimes we use the language around it's a condition, I have autism. Sometimes I hear people talking about, well, autism is a spectrum, you know, so does that mean, you know, we're all autistic to varying degrees on the spectrum? And other people say, no, you're either autistic or you're not. You know, so I really struggle with the narrative and the language around this. From your research, are you able to provide any light on this so that we can engage as a society in a more conscious way around autism?
Right, so I'm going to caveat that with, I don't have the answer to that. Right, there's bigger brains out there than me that are going to come up with that one. So for me, there's some key things, and it's what we were talking about earlier. If you're only going to identify autistic people as disabled, then that's the only label you can have. And then it's just an argument about whether you are autistic or whether you have autism. And for me, the debate is much wider. From a transpersonal perspective, I don't believe that people have diagnoses. Those are human labels to identify certain things in people, to give access to stuff, or identify them, or categorize people for whatever reason. I think from a transpersonal perspective, we have to look more at the neurological influences on our development, on our understanding of things, the way we make sense of stuff, the way we interact, the way we relate. That's a way more interesting debate than whether a label is something as part of your identity or something that you have, or that a certain sector of the population believe you are. Because I think if we start relating to people as autistic, we're going to miss a massive amount of who that person is.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's what labels do, don't they? They kind of fix us, and they only fix an aspect of us. You know, you are this or you are that. But the reality is we're much more broad and much more flexible and dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So how does this all influence the therapeutic relationship between the therapist and the client? These sorts of things we've just been discussing, the narrative, the language, the labeling, the diagnosis, how does that come into the therapeutic relationship between the therapist and a client that has perhaps some autistic traits?
So I think perhaps a little backtrack to where I started with this research was when I worked in the NHS, and we always called them complex. There was some complex clients, right? And you kind of went, oh, right, okay. And you'd see certain members of the team slope off to go and find simpler clients to work with. But the complex clients really fascinated me. And the reason why was because it appeared to be a conundrum that hadn't been solved yet. And none of the therapeutic frameworks that I had fitted with what I was experiencing in the relationship with my clients. So, you know, techniques like mirroring, reflecting, paraphrasing, they just didn't work. Because, you know, if you sit there and you mirror back to the client exactly what they just said, they look at you blankly. That's not affirming to them. It's just confusing as to why you repeat someone else's words back. And by the same token, if they have spent time really thinking about what they wanted to say to you and you rephrase it back to them using your own words, what was wrong with the way I did it? Why are you saying it back to me? Because that you've changed the meaning now. That's not what I meant. So these cause little ruptures in just basic communication that we're taught as therapists. And Terry, I've gone off track and I can't remember the question.
No, that's okay. I was just saying how this all influences the therapeutic relationship around the narrative we use, the language in the labeling and things of that nature. Yeah.
Yes, that's it. So the other bit that gets in the way of doing this, so we've got those techniques. The other bit that gets in the way is the context. So our psychological professional frameworks don't have a context for autistic identity, autistic person. Okay, so all of those contexts are all neuronormative. They don't look at neurodiversity as part of a normal model of human being. And so that context comes in, which is a sort of a template for the therapist to work on. So, and then there's the piece where we look at actually, how do I relate to somebody who is different? So if we're using a diagnostic model, which we do in our training, we're then kind of encumbered with the frameworks we've got, the idea about who this person is and their limitations. Right? That's completely going to impede any ability to empathize with them at all. So the very act of being able to sit in front of another human being and just understand who they are is okay if those frameworks support it. But if they don't, they're going to impede any effort at all to empathize with them. And this is what Damien Milton talks about, the double empathy problem. We accuse autistic people of not having a theory of mind of us, but in therapy, because of our context, we have a struggle to understand their theory of mind, and then get frustrated when they're not reciprocating. Right? So it becomes one of those situations where actually the therapist has to function somehow in that relationship beyond their contexts, and quite lost as to what should be happening or what ought to be happening, or sort of any map to this landscape that's familiar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is that when we use a diagnostic model, we have a model in our heads of what this client or who this client is as such. And then also as well, perhaps we apply some techniques that have been developed by working with people who are not neurodiverse. And then we try and impose them upon the client or the model of the client that we're working with. And both that modeling and then the techniques get in the way of the empathy. We don't meet the client where they are and understand their experience and their empathy. So the techniques that therapists have been trained in creates, as I think you said, a disruption in the relationship, which doesn't allow the therapist to empathize with the client. So is that what you've called in your research, this empathy gap, where that's missing? Yeah.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is, it's not just the empathy and the idea that two people understand each other, which is that double empathy piece. There's also, if the therapist comes with a lens, psychological framework lens, the client is also trying to relate to the psychological lens to understand the client, the clinician. So
Yeah.
it's quite confused as to how to just clear all of that out of the way and just be with the person in front of you.
To just be, to be present, rather than working through all these framework, lenses, models, diagnosis, and just be with the person both ways. Yeah, I can really get that. So how can transpersonal psychology help that relationship to to close the empathy gap, or to allow the therapist and the client to just be with each other? How does transpersonal psychology inform that, enable that? What does it bring?
Okay, so something that comes to mind is one of the things I encountered with complex clients was they're quite risky. And in order to manage risk, you can do you can do several things, but let's do just two. One is you can follow the protocols and procedures for managing risk, right? But actually managing risk requires relationship, because for that you have to have an understanding of what's going on to be able to affect something in the person that moves them from the risky position to an unrisky position. Now, that is rife with all sorts of things. But for me, as a transpersonal therapist, it's the only way to understand what is causing the risk and to really engage that person in the ability to move from that position to a more resourced position that helps them feel less risky or less wanting to do those risky behaviours. So it's the relational aspect of the transpersonal for me that's vital in creating a space between the therapist and the client, which is safe enough for that to be explored. And there's a balance here between disclosure and having to implement protocol, which can then shift the client back into there's been a rupture here and I don't trust your relationship anymore, and moving them through a place of risk into a place of being resourced and coping better.
So what I'm hearing from you there, Debbie, and thank you for explaining that, in many ways, psychology views the person as an individual, and when we work with the person as an individual, Transpersonal psychology also recognizes the space in between and where we meet each other in that space in between. So in many ways, the transpersonal psychologist can help both the therapist and the client to let go of that perhaps ego identity and work together in the space in between. Is that what you're saying? Where you come together, if you like?
Yes, much more, because there's something being paralleled in the process to not do that, where a client with neurological differences is not culturally fitting into psychological frameworks. Well, the issues, we could argue, are about them not fitting into the culturally approved ways of behaving in society, and we parallel it in therapy. So we have to overcome that in some way, but we also have to recognise these clients are habituated to being let down and having protocols thrown at them. So it's I think this is why they get called complex, because there are so many strands that come into helping and supporting and creating a cathartic space. And in transpersonal, we use the word transformation can occur, where something can be changed fundamentally in the fabric of the person's belief about themselves. And that requires a shift from I'm a diagnostic criteria to I'm a human being with an identity, and I have the right to a voice. I have a right to be seen as who I am. And that's a massive shift if therapy doesn't recognise that and society backs it up, right? So the task here is quite fundamental in terms of helping that person find an identity beyond the risks.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm hearing from you, what can get in the way of developing that is the therapist's own training, is the therapist's social conditioning within our society and how we've been conditioned. And all of those create these barriers between the therapist and the client. And so in many ways, the professional development of the therapist is about removing those barriers, letting go of that conditioning, letting go of that training, so they can meet the client being to being, and allow the person then to express themselves as their individual, the client to express themselves as their individual, rather than express themselves in a way that tries to fit in with some sort of model or the therapist training. So it's very much about letting go of that. And my work is around consciousness and consciousness development, and I recognize that the more we develop our consciousness, the more agile we become. But part of developing that consciousness is letting go of these ego identifications that we have, so the consciousness can flow through. Do you think, as a therapist, consciousness development is important?
I don't know a way of doing it without it.
Yeah.
That's a bit like saying to a fish, what's it like to be on land? All my training has been through transpersonal therapy, so I don't know another way of understanding myself or my clients other than through an understanding that my position right now is limited by what I have already understood and experienced. And I am fully aware that this is a process of discovery. It's not a process of arrival. So the idea that we are beginning to understand and we will learn more is fundamental to my approach of working with somebody. It underpins the potential that's in all of us, and I don't know another way of working or being with people.
Lovely, thank you, Debbie. Yeah, so what I'm hearing is really the development of the therapist is always around recognizing what you know and how you project that onto the client, and perhaps letting go of that and having that process of discovery to allow the client to express themselves. And what I'm hearing from you, because people with autistic traits are quite often diagnosed by a model and then have to try and fit into a society that doesn't recognise these neurodiversity, it's even more important to allow that flourishing of the individual client to come through without the projections of the therapist based on what they already know and their models and their social conditioning, etc., etc. Yeah, thank you for that.
I think what you're saying is absolutely bang on, because we've got this idea that being autistic is fixed, but we're no different to any other neurological basis of human being. It's all plastic. It evolves, it changes, it grows, it's informed by new knowledge. The idea that an autistic person wouldn't have emergent qualities or have it, I can't conceive of how that would be like saying, right, there's certain people who just don't change and won't do anything, and that's not my experience at all.
No, yeah, and I think you're right, because all of us, I think we do that in some ways. When we label somebody else, we put a judgment on them, and that judgment fixes them. So yeah, that person's extrovert, that person's autistic, or that person's quiet, whatever it is, and then it fixes them. And of course, because of the medical diagnosis of autism, we use that label and that's that judgment, and it does fix people. You're quite right, but there's no reason why somebody with autistic traits isn't like everybody else, that we're constantly changing, flourishing, evolving constantly. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. And then
Thank you.
we haven't even touched on the idea of gender, culture, race, sexuality.
Yeah.
I've missed them there, but all the intersectional ideas of what autism, autistic mean as an intersectional framework in part of that. We've literally looked at white men. That's it. That the autistic framework is autistic white men.
Really? I wasn't aware of that. Wow.
So, it's not a great model.
No, again, it just fixes the model which everybody else has to try and fit into. Yeah.
Well, so it's not surprising women don't fit it.
No.
And that's just the other half of the population.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing light to that. It's been very informative to me, very enlightening for me to explore this with you. And I've just got one last question, because I know a lot of your work and your research is around the supervision that therapists get to support them in doing their work. So how does this inform supervision? Have you come to any conclusions there, how supervision could be improved to help therapists engage with clients that have autistic traits?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Does that answer your question? Supervision sits in a really tricky place, because it has the same systemic frameworks that the clinician has. So for me, the supervision pair have to overcome the idea of it's the clinician's level of development that's causing them to feel anxious about a client, or it's the client's risk that's the problem. And for me, the supervision pair have to move to a space where they can understand how neurodiversity fits into that picture, because otherwise we're going to miss it, and clinicians aren't going to get the support, because the supervisor's meaning making is misinterpreted of the clinician, and the clinician is a bit lost as to how to understand the client and doesn't understand the client's meaning making. So we have these triple hermeneutics that are coming through in the supervision, and the supervisor has to have a clear idea of how the clinician is framing it, to be able to understand how to support the client. So for me, there's work to be done in being able to address those, and that was one of the key findings in the research, was that supervisors aren't aware of either those hermeneutic steps, because they're much more caseload focused, or the hermeneutic steps are missing neurodiversity, which means that it fails to meet the development needs of the clinician, understanding how that plays out, so that they can synthesize the neurodiversity aspects of the client with their professional frameworks.
Yeah, thank you. And just for clarity, you mentioned that term hermeneutics. Can you just explain what that is a little bit more? What do you mean by that term, please?
Oh, yeah, of course. So hermeneutics is literally how you understand someone else or something else, the meaning making that you bring to it. So as the supervisor understands the clinician is understanding the client, and the client is making sense of their world and their life world. So we have this sort of bunny hop through, and the idea in supervision is that the supervisor somehow has to have a context of the client's meaning making, which is filtered through their understanding of the clinician and the clinician's presentation of their understanding of the client's meaning making. Probably needs a picture.
Well, it sounds like a game of Chinese whispers in many ways,
Yes.
in terms of meaning making. But yeah, and I understand what you're saying there. So if the supervisor is schooled in the therapeutic approaches and is conditioned by society and imposes that meaning making on the therapist, that therapist then imposes that meaning making on the client, and the client feels not listened to, and you've got the empathy gap. So supervision is critically important. Yeah. Well,
Absolutely.
I'd love to keep talking with you about this. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've learnt loads, and thank you. And I feel much more enlightened about how certainly my work as a business psychologist, I can now engage and work with people who have perhaps some autistic traits and allow them to flourish as their individual being rather than labeling people. And that's what I've really taken away from this. So it's been really enlightening for me. So thank you, Debbie. Thank you. I really appreciate you talking with me today.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for having me along.